The Once and Future Present, Episode 12, Sparks and Swords, Reformations and Religious Wars, brought to you by Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Once and Future Present. I'm your host, Casey Brooks. Today we are diving into one of the most important and dramatic periods in European history, the Reformation. It's a time of radical religious change, political realignment, war, and, believe it or not, a whole lot of printing presses. With me, as always, our Professor Theo.
Good to be here, Casey. This century was a theological earthquake. Ideas that had been simmering for centuries finally boiled over.
And Dr. Morgan.
And when religion explodes, politics goes with it. Princes, kings, and commoners all got swept into this storm. You can't understand early modern Europe without the Reformation.
Okay, then let's start at the beginning. Why did people suddenly want to change the church?
It wasn't sudden. By 1500, there had been centuries of anti-clericalism, opposition to the clergy. People criticized church leaders for corruption, greed, and behaving more like princes than pastors. Many bishops held multiple positions, never visited their parishes, and collected income from faraway lands.
And remember, the papacy itself had a bad reputation. Between the Babylonian captivity in Avignon and the Great Schism, there was a deep feeling that church leadership had lost its moral compass.
So people felt like the church wasn't living up to its message?
Exactly. Add to that the fact that many people were deeply religious. They didn't reject faith, but wanted a purer version of it. A huge flashpoint was the sale of indulgences. These were documents sold by the church that promised to reduce time in purgatory, a place where souls were purified before going to heaven.
Wait, so you could pay to get your sins reduced?
That was the idea, though in theory it was supposed to reflect true repentance. But in practice, it looked like salvation was for sale. And that's what pushed a German monk named Martin Luther over the edge.
The guy with the 95 Theses, right?
Yes, in 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther drafted a list of points for debate, called the 95 Theses. These were written critiques of the Church's practices, especially the sale of indulgences, which Luther saw as spiritually misleading and morally corrupt.
So he just nailed them up on the church door to start a revolution?
That's the popular image, and it might have happened. But his intention wasn't rebellion. Luther originally saw himself as a loyal Catholic. He hoped to start an academic discussion to correct abuses from within the church. That's why he wrote the theses in Latin, not German. He was addressing educated clergy and theologians, not the general public.
But the context mattered. The church was raising money through indulgences to help fund the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. One priest in particular, Johann Tetzel, was aggressively selling them with slogans like, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." It enraged Luther.
So, what changed? How did it go from a debate to a public movement?
The printing press played a huge role. Someone translated the theses into German and printed them widely. Suddenly, what had been a scholarly proposal exploded into public controversy. And once people got hold of Luther's ideas, especially his belief that salvation came by faith alone, not through works or church rituals, it became a mass movement.
That was the real break. The church demanded that Luther recant, but he refused. In 1521, he was excommunicated and declared an outlaw by the Diet of Worms. But by then, it was too late to put the genie back in the bottle.
So he didn't mean to start a new branch of Christianity?
Not at first. Luther hoped for reform, but when reform was blocked, the movement grew into something new, a permanent break that we now call the Protestant Reformation.
Luther's ideas were dangerous. Pope Leo X declared him a heretic, and in 1521, Emperor Charles V summoned him to the Diet of Worms, a formal assembly. Luther refused to recant, his famous words, "Here I stand, I can do no other."
What happened to him?
He was declared an outlaw, but a sympathetic prince, Frederick of Saxony, hid him away. During that time, Luther translated the Bible into German, making it accessible to ordinary people.
So did all of Germany go Protestant right away?
Not quite. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of territories. Some princes supported Luther for theological reasons, others because it gave them a chance to confiscate church land and assert their independence from the emperor.
And Luther wasn't the only reformer. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli rejected practices not based in Scripture, like fasting and clerical celibacy. Meanwhile, John Calvin in Geneva developed a more systematic theology.
What made Calvin different?
He wrote The Institutes of the Christian Religion, a book that laid out a structured vision of Christian doctrine. Calvin emphasized predestination, the idea that God had already decided who would be saved and who would be damned, entirely based on his will, not on anything a person did in life.
Wait, so nothing you do can change your fate? Then why even try?
That was a common reaction, actually. But Calvin argued that the elect, those predestined for salvation, would naturally live in a godly way. Their actions wouldn't cause their salvation, but they would reflect it. It created a kind of moral pressure. You were supposed to behave as if you were saved, even though you didn't know for sure.
And here's where it gets complicated socially. Under Catholic teaching, the path to salvation included doing good works, like giving to the poor or donating to hospitals and orphanages. Supporting the needy was seen as a spiritual duty. But in Calvinist thought, that kind of charity didn't change your eternal fate. And worse, it raised uncomfortable questions.
Like, why would you help someone who was being punished by God?
Exactly. If wealth was a sign of being blessed, chosen by God, then poverty started to be interpreted as a sign of divine punishment. Poor people weren't just unlucky, they were seen by some as morally or spiritually defective. This thinking eroded the earlier religious obligation to help the poor.
It created a kind of theological class divide. The rich were seen not only as successful, but as spiritually superior. And many Protestants, especially Calvinists in the Netherlands, Scotland, and parts of France, used that logic to justify pulling back from traditional Catholic forms of charity.
So, poverty became a personal failure instead of something to help with?
Yes, and that view has had a long legacy. In some ways, it laid the ideological groundwork for early capitalism and the idea of the deserving versus undeserving poor. It's one of those moments where theology reshaped economic and social attitudes on a massive scale.
That's really sad. I hadn't realized that a belief about salvation could end up changing how people treat each other every day.
That's why studying ideas like predestination isn't just about religion. It's about the deep structures of society and how people make sense of inequality. Calvin also promoted strict moral discipline. Geneva became a model of Protestant order. No gambling, no dancing, and definitely no swearing.
So, where did Calvinism spread?
To Scotland, where John Knox established the Presbyterian Church, to the Netherlands, and to France, where followers became known as Huguenots.
That leads to conflict, right?
Absolutely. In France, Catholic monarchs clashed with Huguenot nobles. In 1572, during a royal wedding meant to ease tensions, Catholic mobs launched the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, killing thousands of Protestants.
That's horrifying.
It was one of the darkest moments of the French Wars of Religion. But eventually, a moderate Catholic named Henry of Navarre became king, Henry IV. He converted to Catholicism to unify the country, supposedly saying, "Paris is worth a mass."
That's kind of clever.
Henry issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which gave Protestants the right to worship in certain cities. It didn't end all conflict, but it brought a measure of peace.
Can I ask something? Why did it matter so much to kings what religion their people practiced? Like, why not just let everyone believe what they want?
Great question, Casey. And the short answer is control. In the 1500s, religion wasn't just a personal belief. It was a foundation for political legitimacy. Monarchs often claimed the divine right of kings, the idea that their authority came directly from God. If your people followed a different religion than you did, it could look like they were rejecting not just your church, but your right to rule.
And don't forget, religious unity was tied to national unity. If a ruler was Catholic and his subjects became Protestant, it wasn't just a spiritual disagreement, it felt like rebellion.
Exactly. Think about it. If salvation comes from loyalty to the Pope, then a Protestant king is leading people away from truth. And if salvation comes from Scripture alone, then a Catholic monarch looks like a tyrant. That tension often led to civil war.
So letting people choose their own religion would have seemed like losing control.
Yes, and it took centuries before European governments began separating religion from state power. During the Reformation era, religious conformity was seen as essential for stability and authority.
That makes sense. So Protestants were only in France and Germany? What about England? I know they broke from the Catholic Church too.
Ah, the English Reformation. That's a story of its own. The English Reformation had very different origins than the one in Germany. In 1534, King Henry VIII broke with the Roman Catholic Church, not over theology, but because the Pope refused to grant him an annulment.
That was so he could marry Anne Boleyn, right?
Exactly. But there's more to it. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor.
Wait, the Charles V who was trying to stop the Reformation in Germany?
The very same. So when Henry asked Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine, the Pope was in an impossible position. If he granted the annulment, he would anger Charles V, who had just marched troops into Rome in 1527 and held the Pope under his influence. That made it politically dangerous for the Pope to side with Henry.
So Henry took matters into his own hands. In 1534, he passed the Act of Supremacy, which declared him the supreme head of the Church of England. That meant no more authority from the Pope.
And it wasn't just a spiritual move. It was a massive land grab. Henry dissolved England's monasteries, seizing their lands and wealth and redistributing them to nobles loyal to him. It tied the elite class to the new Church of England.
But did anything actually change for ordinary people?
Not right away. Under Henry, the Church of England remained pretty traditional. Services were still in Latin, and the theology was still mostly Catholic. The real doctrinal shift came later, under his son Edward VI, who pushed Protestant reforms, and then again under his daughter Elizabeth I, who established a more moderate but clearly Protestant identity.
And that's when Philip II of Spain launched the Spanish Armada?
Correct. Philip saw Protestant England, and especially Elizabeth, as a threat to Catholic Europe. In 1588, he sent the Spanish Armada to invade England. But bad weather and strong English resistance led to a major defeat for Spain.
So that was like a turning point in Europe?
Definitely. The failure of the Armada preserved English independence and Protestantism. It also signaled the decline of Spanish dominance at sea and the rise of England as a global naval power.
And what about Spain itself? Did the Reformation spread there?
Very little. Spain was at the heart of the Catholic Reformation, also known as the Counter-Reformation. The Church didn't just fight back, it reformed itself.
One powerful institution was the Holy Office, or Roman Inquisition, which tried to stamp out heresy through censorship and trials. But there was also renewal. The Council of Trent, which met from 1545 to 1563, reaffirmed Catholic doctrine and addressed abuses.
So they didn't give in to Protestant ideas?
No, they doubled down on tradition, but made real changes. Better educated priests, stricter discipline, and new seminaries for training clergy. The changes made by the Catholic Church are represented in the creation of the Jesuits, or Society of Jesus. This religious order was founded by Ignatius Loyola in 1540. He was a former soldier who turned to intense spiritual discipline after being wounded in battle. His book, Spiritual Exercises, became a kind of training manual for how to shape one's mind and soul in obedience to God and the Church.
So they were like spiritual special forces?
That's a great way to think of them. The Jesuits were rigorously trained and deeply committed to the Pope. Their mission was to fight the spread of Protestantism and renew the Catholic Church through education, preaching, and missionary work.
They built schools and universities across Europe and beyond, places like Paris, Rome, and Krakow, but also far afield in Asia and the Americas. They became advisors to kings, confessors to princes, and tutors to future leaders. Wherever the church needed strong intellectual and moral leadership, the Jesuits were often sent in.
Were they successful?
Very much so. In places like Poland, Bohemia, and southern Germany, they helped reverse Protestant gains and bring those regions back to Catholicism. And in the global context, they were some of the first Europeans to reach places like China, Japan, and India, adapting Christianity to local cultures in surprisingly thoughtful ways, at least early on.
But they also drew suspicion. Some Protestants saw them as dangerous agents of papal control. Their influence in courts and politics led to conspiracy theories in later centuries. Still, they were undeniably one of the most effective arms of the Catholic Reformation.
So, while Protestants were spreading their ideas through printing and sermons, the Jesuits were out there doing diplomacy, education, and mission work?
Exactly. The Catholic Church wasn't standing still, it was adapting and moving outward. The Jesuits helped turn Catholicism into a truly global religion, even as Europe itself was being torn apart by religious conflict.
Let's back up a bit, because one area we haven't talked about yet is the Holy Roman Empire, where religion and politics were inseparable. The Emperor, Charles V, ruled over a patchwork of hundreds of territories, each with its own leader, and he saw himself as the defender of Catholicism.
Wait, is this the same Charles V who was also King of Spain?
Yes, he was a member of the Habsburg family, and by inheritance, he ruled over a vast empire. Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, and the many semi-independent states of the Holy Roman Empire.
But holding that all together was a nightmare. His territories were religiously and culturally diverse, and while Lutheranism was spreading rapidly in northern and central Europe, Charles also faced growing threats from the southeast.
From who?
The Ottoman Empire. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans were expanding deep into southeastern Europe. In 1526, they defeated the Hungarian monarchy at the Battle of Mohacs, killing King Louis II and effectively ending independent Hungary. Just a few years later, in 1529, they besieged Vienna, the very heart of the Habsburg.
That far into Europe? I didn't realize they were that powerful.
Absolutely. The Ottomans were one of the greatest powers of the 16th century, and their presence in Europe was real and growing. For Charles, it meant constantly juggling multiple fronts, fighting Protestants in the north, defending his borders from the Ottomans in the east, and trying to manage Spain and its empire overseas.
And that pressure gave Protestantism space to spread. Charles couldn't commit enough military or political resources to stop the Protestant princes. Many of them saw an opportunity to assert both their religious and political independence.
So the Ottomans accidentally helped Protestantism?
In a way, yes. It's a great example of contingency, the idea that one historical event can change the outcome of another. But here's what's really fascinating. The Ottoman Empire had a completely different approach to religion.
How so?
The Ottomans governed a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. Muslims were the ruling class, but Christians and Jews were allowed to practice their religions openly. They were organized into millets, religious communities that had a degree of autonomy. As long as they paid taxes and pledged loyalty to the Sultan, they could govern their own affairs.
That's in sharp contrast to Europe, where religious uniformity was often seen as essential to political stability. After the Reformation began, most European rulers expected their subjects to follow one faith, either Catholic or a specific form of Protestantism.
So Europe was trying to enforce one religion per state, but the Ottomans were more pluralistic?
Exactly. That doesn't mean the Ottoman system was perfectly tolerant. Non-Muslims were second-class citizens, but the state accepted religious diversity as a practical necessity. In Europe, by contrast, religious difference was often seen as treason or rebellion.
That's why the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was such a big deal. It allowed rulers in the Holy Roman Empire to choose either Catholicism or Lutheranism for their territories. But individual religious freedom? That idea was still a long way off. The Peace of Augsburg allowed each ruler in the Holy Roman Empire to choose whether their territory would be Lutheran or Catholic. It's summed up in the Latin phrase cuius regio eius religio, whose realm his religion.
So the people had to follow whatever their ruler picked?
Yes, no freedom of religion for individuals, but it did stop some of the fighting, at least temporarily. The catch was that it only recognized Lutheranism, not Calvinism or other Protestant groups.
And that would lead to more conflict down the road. But before we go there, we should talk about the social impact of these religious changes.
You mean how ordinary people's lives were affected?
Yes, in Protestant areas, services were held in the vernacular, German, Dutch, English, rather than Latin. The Bible was translated and printed widely, which meant that literacy became even more important. Protestant reformers wanted every Christian to read the Bible for themselves.
That must have been really empowering for people.
It was, but also confusing and sometimes destabilizing. Without a single authority, interpretations multiplied, and Protestant ideas also affected the family. Reformers like Luther argued that marriage was the proper place for sexual relations, not celibacy, and emphasized the role of pastors' wives as models of Christian womanhood.
What about women in general? Did the Reformation help them?
That's a complicated question. On the one hand, some Protestant women gained influence by hosting religious discussions or writing theological texts. On the other hand, the closure of convents took away one of the few alternatives to marriage for women. Most reformers emphasized obedience and motherhood as women's primary roles.
We also see major changes in how governments used religion to shape society. In Geneva, for example, John Calvin and his followers created a theocratic city where the church regulated morality very strictly, banning dancing, gambling, and even certain clothing.
That sounds intense. Was it popular?
It had critics, but also followers. Calvinism appealed to people who wanted discipline and certainty in chaotic times. And its emphasis on a calling, the idea that all work could be holy, gave it a lasting influence, especially in places like Scotland and the Netherlands. And while all this was happening, the Catholic Church wasn't just reacting, it was reforming itself.
Right. You mentioned the Jesuits earlier?
Yes, the Jesuits, or Society of Jesus, were founded by Ignatius Loyola in 1540. They became a driving force in Catholic renewal. Jesuits ran schools, advised kings, and led missionary work in Asia and the Americas.
Another tool of Catholic reform was the Holy Office, or Roman Inquisition. It was created in 1542 to combat heresy and discipline clergy. The Church also banned certain books and tightened doctrinal control.
Wasn't there also a big council?
Indeed, the Council of Trent, which met in 3 sessions between 1545 and 1563. It reaffirmed traditional Catholic teachings like the importance of both faith and good works, the 7 sacraments, and clerical celibacy.
But it also reformed abuses. Bishops had to live in their dioceses. Seminaries were established to train priests properly, and indulgences were restricted to prevent abuse.
So the Catholic Church didn't just collapse, it adapted?
Exactly. The Church emerged from the Reformation more unified and disciplined, even if it lost parts of Europe to Protestantism.
But let's not forget, this was also an era of fear and repression. The religious conflict fueled witch hunts, especially in areas with contested religious authority. Tens of thousands, mostly women, were executed.
That's awful. Why women?
Many people believed women were more susceptible to temptation. The stereotype of the witch, older, widowed, poor, reflected fears about disorder in a rapidly changing society.
This whole century feels like a mix of renewal and destruction.
That's a great way to put it. Let's wrap up with a review of the 5 C's of historical thinking, just like we did in the last episode.
Okay, so let's start with contextualization.
The Reformations didn't come out of nowhere. They emerged in a context of frustration with church corruption, rising literacy, new technology like the printing press, and increasing power struggles between rulers and the church.
Causation. Key causes included anti-clericalism, indulgence controversies, rising nationalism, and the desire of rulers to control religion in their own lands.
Change and continuity?
Major changes included the fragmentation of Christianity, the rise of state churches, and reforms in both Protestant and Catholic worlds. but there was continuity in terms of persecution of dissenters and limits on religious freedom.
Contingency. What if the printing press hadn't existed? What if Charles V had crushed the Lutherans early? So much could have gone differently.
And complexity? Thanks so much, both of you. I feel like I just lived through a century of fire and reform.
That's the right feeling. And it sets the stage for our next topic. Europe reaches beyond itself into global conquest and empire.
Thanks for listening, everyone. This has been the Once and Future Present. Until next time, stay curious and think critically.